Ronia the Robber's Daughter, Chapter 5. That evening, Ronia sat in front of the fire with her father for a time, and then she remembered what it was she wanted to know. "What is it that you have taken without asking, as Borka said?"
Said Matt. "I was so afraid you wouldn't find your way home in the fog, my Ronia."
"But I did," Ronia said. "Listen, what is it that you have taken without asking?"
"Look there," said Matt, pointing excitedly into the fire. "Don't you see? It looks just like an old man. It looks like Borka. How horrid!"
But Ronia could see no sign of Borka in the fire, and she wasn't the least bit interested. "What is it you have taken without asking?" she insisted. When Matt did not answer, Noddle Pete answered for him.
"A lot of things. Oh, ho, ho. Yes, a lot of things. I reckon it's about—" "Stop that," Matt said angrily. "I will deal with this myself."
All the robbers except Noddle Pete had already gone to their rooms. Levis was out settling her chickens and goats and sheep for the night, so it was only Noddle Pete who heard Matt explaining to Ronia what a robber really was. A person who took things without asking and without permission. Matt had no need to be ashamed of that. On the contrary, he usually blustered and bragged that he was the greatest robber chieftain in all the woods and mountains. But it was a little harder now that he had to tell Ronia about it. Of course, he had intended to tell her all about it sooner or later when it was necessary, but he had wanted to wait a little.
"Little innocent child that you are, my Ronia. That's why I haven't talked much about it before."
"No, you haven't said a word," Noddle Pete assured him. "And we weren't allowed to say anything either."
"Old man, isn't it about time you went to bed?" said Matt.
But Noddle Pete said that it wasn't. He wanted to hear this. And Ronia understood. Now at last she understood where everything came from. All the things the robbers had on their horses' backs when they came riding home in the evening, all the goods in sacks and bundles, all the precious things in chests and boxes. They didn't grow on trees in the forest. Her father simply took them from other people. "But don't they get terribly angry when you take their things away from them?" asked Ronia.
Noddle Pete sniggered. "Angry fit to bust," he assured her. Oh dear, you should just hear them." "Old man, it would be a good thing if you finally went to bed now," said Matt. But Noddle Pete still would not go.
"Some of them even cry," he told Ronia.
Then Matt roared, "Now be quiet, otherwise I'll throw you out."
He patted Ronia's cheek.
"You've just got to understand, Ronia. That's the way it is. That's the way it has always been. It's nothing to make a fuss about."
"No, it isn't," said Noddle Pete. "But people never do get used to things. They go on howling and crying and swearing till it's a pleasure to hear them."
Matt gave him an angry glare.
Then he turned back to Ronia.
"My father was a robber chief, and so was my grandfather, and my great-grandfather, as you know, and I haven't let them down. I'm a robber chieftain, too, the mightiest in all the woods and mountains. And that's what you're going to be, too, Ronia mine."
"Me?" shouted Ronia. "Never! Not if they get angry and cry." Matt scratched his head. He was worried now. He wanted Ronia to admire and love him as much as he loved and admired her. And here she was shouting "Never!" and refusing to be a robber chief like her father. That made Matt unhappy. He must find a way to get her to believe that what he was doing was right and good.
"You see, Ronia, darling, I take only from the rich," he protested.
Then he thought for a moment.
"And I give to the poor, I really do."
Noddle Pete sniggered. "Oh, my goodness, yes, that's true enough. You gave that poor widow with 8 children a whole sack of flour, remember?"
"Quite so," said Matt. "I did indeed."
He stroked his black beard with satisfaction. He was very pleased now, both with himself and with Noddle Pete. Noddle Pete sniggered again. "You have a good memory, you have, Matt. Let's see, that must have been 10 years ago. Oh, yes, of course you give to the poor every 10 years, give or take a year." Then Matt roared,
"If you don't go to bed now, I know someone who's going to help you get there."
But it was not necessary, because at that moment Lovis came in and Noddle Pete went off without assistance. Ronia went to bed, and the fire died as Lovis sang the wolf song, and Ronia lay there, listening, and not bothering whether her father was a robber chieftain or not. He was her Matt, whatever he did, and she loved him. That night she slept badly and dreamed of the unearthly ones and their enticing song. But she had forgotten all about them when she woke up. What she remembered was Berk. In the days that followed, she sometimes thought of him and wondered how he was getting on over in Borka's keep, and how long it would be before Matt finally drove his father and their whole robber tribe out of his fort. Matt was drawing up great new plans for action every day, but none of them was much good. "No use," said Noddle Pete, no matter what Matt thought of. "You'll have to be as cunning as a fox, because force won't work." It did not suit Matt to be cunning as a fox, but he did his best. And while this was going on, not much robbery took place. The Borka robbers had other things to think about too, and the people who had to pass through the robbers' walk in those days were surprised at how free from robbers it was. They could not understand why it was so peaceful. Where had all the highwaymen gone? The sheriff's men who had hunted Borka so persistently found the cave where his robber's den had been, but it was deserted now and empty of loot. There was no sign of Borka, and the soldiers were glad to be able to leave Borka's wood at last, dark and cold and rainy as it was now that autumn had come. Of course, they knew there were robbers far away in Matt's forest as well, but they preferred not to think about that. There was no worse place, and the robber chieftain who lived there was harder to catch than an eagle on a cliff top. They would rather leave him in peace. Matt spent most of his time trying to work out what the Borka robbers were up to over in the North Fort, and what would be the best way to get at them. So he went out scouting every day. With 1 or 2 of his men, he rode to the wood on the north side, but there was no sign of the invaders. For the most part, it was as silent and dead as if there were no Borka robbers there. But they had made themselves a fine, long rope ladder, so they could get up and down the rock face without difficulty. Matt saw it being lowered only once. He lost his head completely and rushed forward like a madman to clamber up it. His robbers followed him, burning with lust for battle. But a shower of arrows came down from the loopholes of Borka's keep, and little Snip got one in the thigh that kept him in bed for 2 days. Obviously, the rope ladder was lowered only under strict guard. The autumn clouds now hung heavily over Matt's fort, and the robbers were not enjoying their inactivity. They became restless and squabbled more than usual until Lovis could stand it no longer. "You'll burst my eardrums soon, with all your wrangling and nagging. I'll gag all of you if you don't hold your peace." They fell silent, and Lovis set them to useful work, clearing out and cleaning the hen house, and the sheepfold, and the goat stall, all of which they heartily disliked. But no one got out of it, except Noddle Pete, and those who happened to be on guard at the Wolf's Neck and up at Hell's Gap. Mat also did his best to keep his robbers going. He took them on elk hunts, setting out with spears and bows in the autumn woods, and Noddle Pete smiled contentedly when they returned dragging 4 big elk carcasses behind them. "Chicken soup and mutton soup and porridge don't serve a man long," he said. "Now we'll have something to chew on, and the tenderest bits go to the toothless, as everyone knows." And Lovis roasted elk meat and smoked elk meat and salted down elk meat for the winter, to supplement the roast chicken and the legs of mutton. Ronia spent her time in the woods as usual. It was very quiet there now, but she thought even the autumn woods were good to wander in. The moss was soft and green and damp under her bare feet. The smell of autumn was wonderful, and the branches of the trees glistened with moisture. It often rained, and she liked to sit hunched under a thick fir tree, listening to the gentle pattering outside. Sometimes it poured down until the whole wood was running with rain, and she liked that too. There were not many animals to be seen. Her foxes stayed in their dens, but sometimes in the dusk she saw elk come trotting by, and sometimes wild horses grazing among the trees. She longed to catch a wild horse for herself, and she had often tried, but without success. The wild horses were very shy, and would certainly be hard to tame, but it was time she had a horse. She had told Mat so.
"Yes, when you're strong enough to catch one yourself," he had replied.
"And one day I shall," she thought. "I'll catch a lovely little one and take it home to Mat's fort and tame it the way Mat did with all his horses." Otherwise, the autumn woods were strangely deserted. All the creatures which were usually there had vanished. They had probably crept into their holes and hiding places. Sometimes, though quite rarely, harpies came swooping down from the mountains, but they were calmer now and mostly stayed up in their mountain retreats. The gray dwarfs kept away too. Just once Ronia saw 1 or 2 of them peeping out from behind a stone, but she was no longer frightened of gray dwarfs. "Get out of here!" she shouted, and they ran off with hoarse hissing sounds. Berk never appeared in her woods, and of course she was glad of that. Or was she? Sometimes she was not sure how she felt. Then winter came. Snow fell, the air grew cold, and the frost transformed Ronia's forest into an ice forest, more beautiful than she could have imagined. She went skiing there, and when she turned to go home at twilight, she had frost in her hair and frozen toes and fingers in spite of her leather gloves and boots. But neither cold nor snow could keep her away from the forest. The next day she was there again. Mat was sometimes worried when he saw her rushing off down the slopes toward the Wolf's Neck, and he said to Lovis, as he had so often before,
"I hope everything's all right. I hope nothing awful happens to her. I couldn't live if it did."
"What are you moaning about?" said Lovis. "That child can take care of herself better than any robber. How often do I have to tell you?" And of course Ronia could take care of herself. But one day something happened which it was just as well Mat did not know about. More snow had fallen in the night and covered up all Ronia's ski tracks. She would have to make new ones, and it was hard work. The cold had already laid a thin coating of ice over the snow, but it was not strong enough. She kept on breaking through it, and finally she could make no more tracks. She wanted to go home. She had made her way up to a knoll and was going to shoot down the other side. It was a sheer drop, but she raced off fearlessly, the snow rising in clouds around her. There was a sudden dip in the ground, and she flew over it. But in her flight, she lost one ski, and when she landed, her foot broke through the snow into a deep hole. She saw her ski disappearing down the slope while she herself was stuck in the hole up to her knee. It made her laugh at first, but she soon stopped laughing when she realized how bad things were. She could not free herself, no matter how hard she pulled and tugged. She could hear a murmur from the hole and could not think at first what was making it. But it was not long before she saw a party of Rump Hobbs toiling up through the snow a little way off. They were easily recognizable by their broad rumps and wrinkled little faces and scrubby hair. On the whole, Rump Hobbs were friendly and peaceable and did no harm. But these, staring at her with their simple eyes, were obviously annoyed. They grunted and sighed, and one of them said morosely, "What for did un want to do that?" And soon the others were joining in. "What for did un do that? Broke our roof. What for did un?" Ronia realized that she had stuck her foot into their underground hole. The Rump Hobbs made these holes for themselves when they could not find a nice rotten tree to live in. "I couldn't help it," she said. "Help me get my leg out." But the Rump Hobbs just stared at her and sighed as morosely as before. "Un stuck in the roof. What for did un do it?" Ronia was growing impatient. "Well, help me then, and I'll go away." But it was as if they did not hear or understand. They just stared blankly at her, and then ran quickly back to their hole. She could hear their irritable muttering down there. But suddenly they began to shriek and howl, as if they were pleased about something. "She do go!" they shrieked. "She do swing there! She go!" And Ronia could feel something hanging from her foot, something heavy. "Little boy, he hang good there!" shrieked the Rump Hobbs. "See un's cradle. We might have a nasty old foot in the roof." But Ronia had no desire to lie in the cold and snow holding up the cradle for some stupid Rump Hobbs. She tried again. She tugged and jerked as hard as she could to free herself, and the Rump Hobbs cheered. "Little boy, he be rockin' fine, see?" You must not be frightened in Matt's forest. They had been telling her that since she was small, and she had tried to arm herself against fear. But sometimes it was no good. Just now it was no good. What if she couldn't get free? What if she lay here and froze to death this very night? She saw the dark snow clouds over the forest. There was more snow coming, lots of snow. Perhaps she would lie hidden underneath it, dead and frozen stiff, rocking a little Rump Hob on her foot, dangling until spring. Not till then would Matt be able to come and find his poor little daughter who had frozen to death in the wintry forest. "No, no!" she yelled. "Help! Come and help me!" But who was there to hear her in these empty woods? Not a soul. She knew that, but she went on shouting till she could shout no longer. And then she heard the Rump Hobbs grumbling again. "Un's been and stopped rockin' now. What for did un—" Then Ronia heard them no more, for she had seen the Wild Harpy. like a beautiful great black bird of prey. The harpy came swooping across the forest, high up under the dark clouds, then dropped down and came in closer. Straight towards Ronia she flew, and Ronia closed her eyes. Nothing could save her now, she knew. Screeching and cackling, the harpy landed beside her. "Pretty little human!" she screamed shrilly, pulling at Ronia's hair. "Just taking a little rest. Oh, yes, ho, ho!" She cackled again, and it was the most horrid sound. "You'll have to come work for us, up in the mountains, till the blood runs, or else we'll scratch you, or else we'll claw you." The harpy began to tear and slash at Ronia with her sharp claws, and when Ronia lay still motionless, she flew into a rage. "Do you want me to scratch and claw you?" She bent over Ronia, her stony black eyes gleaming wickedly. Then she made another effort to get Ronia free, but no matter how she tugged and tore, it was no use, and in the end she tired of it. "Then I'll go and fetch my sisters," she screamed. "We'll get you tomorrow. You'll never take another rest here, never, never!" And off she flew over the treetops and disappeared toward the mountain peaks. Tomorrow, when the wild harpies come, there will be nothing here but a lump of ice, Ronia thought. There was silence now down in the Rump Hobbs hole. The whole forest was silent, waiting for the night to come. Ronia was not waiting for anything else herself. She lay still. She had given up struggling. It would come now, she thought, the last cold, dark, lonely night, which would put an end to her. The snow had begun to fall, and big flakes settled softly on her face. They melted there and mixed with her tears. For she was crying now. She was thinking of Matt and Lovis. She would never see them again, and no one would ever be happy again in Matt's fort. Poor Matt! He would lose his senses with sorrow, and there would be no Ronia there to comfort him, as she used to do when he was sad. No, there was no comfort to be given now, and none to be had, none at all. Then she heard someone speaking her name. She heard it clearly and distinctly, but she knew that it must be a dream, and that made her cry again. Never more, except in dreams, would anyone call her by name, and soon she would not even dream any longer. But then she heard the voice once again. "Ronia, shouldn't you go home now?" She opened her eyes reluctantly, and there stood Berk. Yes, there stood Berk, on his skis. "I found your ski down at the bottom, and that was pure luck, because otherwise you'd have gone on lying here." He put the ski down on the snow beside her. "Need help, do you?" Then she was crying in earnest, so loudly and so desperately that she was ashamed. She was crying so hard that she could not answer him, but when he bent down to lift her up, she flung her arms around him and muttered frenziedly, "Don't leave me! Don't ever leave me again!" That made him smile. "No, as long as you keep a rope's length away. Let go of me and stop howling, and I'll see if I can get you free." He took off his skis, lay down beside her, and thrust his hand as far as he could into the hole. And when he had worked at it for a long time, the miracle happened. Ronia could pull her leg up. She was free. But the Rump Hobbs in their hole were angry, and their little one whimpered, "Woke little boy up, and he got dirt in his eye. What for did undo it?" Ronia cried. She could not stop herself. Berk handed her the ski. "Stop howling, otherwise you'll never get home." Ronia drew a deep breath. Yes, the crying was over now. She got to her feet and tested her leg to see if it would hold her. "I've got to try," she said. "And you'll come too, won't you?" "I'll come too," said Berk. Ronia set off and made the run down the slope, and Berk followed her. All the time, as she skied painfully homeward in the swirling snow, she had him behind her. Time and again she had to make sure that he was still there. She was so frightened that he might suddenly disappear and leave her on her own. But he was following her, a rope's length away, until they were nearly at the wolf's neck. There they had to part. From there, Berk would take a secret way back to Borka's keep. They stood silently for a time in the falling snow, trying to say goodbye. It was difficult, Ronia felt, and she wanted with all her strength to keep him there. "Listen, Berk," she said. "I wish you were my brother." Berk laughed. "Why shouldn't I be, if you like, robber's daughter?" "I do like," she said, "but only if you call me Ronia." "Ronia, sister mine," said Berk, and then he was gone in the whirling snow.